The year was 2237, and humanity had reached farther than ever before. The blue glow of Earth was now just a small memory in the night sky, as new colonies spread across the stars. One of those distant outposts was Vega 9, a quiet planet with red dust plains, silver mountains, and a sky that shimmered faintly with two suns. To most, it was just another forgotten rock in the galaxy, but for the 120 soldiers stationed there, it was home. Their job was simple: protect the communication relay that linked the outer colonies to Central Command. Days were calm and routine. The soldiers built gardens in old cargo pods, watched holographic movies under the stars, and dreamed of going home once their duty was done. But peace in space never lasted long. It began without warning. The horizon turned white, then red, as flashes of light lit up the sky like falling stars. The alarms screamed through the base before anyone could react. "Incoming! Multiple contacts!" someone shouted. The ground shook, dust rising into the air as the first blast struck near the outpost. It wasn't pirates or raiders, it was something far more powerful. From the clouds above descended dark, angular ships unlike anything they had seen before. They moved silently, without sound, their weapons cutting through the air with deadly precision. The Varkan had come. No one knew where they were from or why they attacked, but in minutes they turned Vega 9 into chaos. Captain Elias Ward ordered his men to their positions, his voice calm despite the panic around him. "Hold the line," he said, gripping the railing as another explosion shook the base. Communication officers tried to reach command, but every signal came back with static. "They've jammed everything," one whispered, terror in his eyes. The outer defenses fell first, fire lighting up the night as plasma storms rained down. Soldiers ran through the corridors carrying wounded comrades, shouting orders that were swallowed by the roar of destruction. Within hours, the once bright colony was gone, its towers broken, its runways cracked, its skies filled with drifting smoke. When the bombardment finally stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. The ground still burned, and the air smelled of metal and ash. Ward stepped out from the ruins of the command post, his uniform torn, his face streaked with soot. Around him, scattered survivors began to gather, some limping, some helping others walk. Of the hundreds who once served there, only 89 remained. No ships, no radio, no link to home. Just the wind howling across a dead world. A younger soldier looked at Ward and asked in a trembling voice, "Are we the only ones left?" Ward stared at the sky for a long time before answering. "For now," he said quietly. "But we're still breathing. And that means we fight." That night, under the broken sky of Vega 9, humanity's last battalion built fires out of shattered debris. They didn't know if anyone would ever come for them. But in their eyes burned something the Varkan could never destroy: the will to survive. When the last echoes of battle faded, the world of Vega 9 was silent. Smoke drifted through the broken sky, and the faint crackle of burning metal was the only sound left. From the ruins of the outpost, a few figures began to move, dust-covered, limping, but alive. They looked like shadows against the red sand, carrying what little they could salvage from the wreckage. Captain Elias Ward led them out, his face streaked with ash, his uniform torn, his eyes hollow from hours without rest. He counted the survivors by name, his voice rough but steady. 89, out of thousands, only 89. The rest were gone, buried under twisted steel, vaporized in the first wave, or lost in the fires that consumed the base. The silence that followed the bombardment was heavier than any explosion. They set up camp among the wreckage using pieces of hulls and armor plates as shelter. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and scorched earth. The youngest soldier stared at the horizon where the colony once stood and whispered, "We're finished." No one answered. A few talked about surrender, hoping the Varkan might spare them if they laid down their weapons. Others sat quietly, holding on to scraps of photos or trinkets from home. The thought of never hearing from Earth again gnawed at them like hunger. Every attempt to reach command ended in static. Every flare they launched disappeared into the endless sky. The stars above, once symbols of hope, now looked cold and far away. Captain Ward stood in the center of the camp, watching his people crumble. His own hands shook when he thought of the families waiting light years away, believing their loved ones were safe. He took a deep breath and climbed onto a half-buried transport wing. "Listen to me," he called out. The soldiers looked up, tired and broken. "No one left us," he said. "We're just too far to be heard." His words cut through the despair like a spark through darkness. He wasn't shouting, but his calm strength carried further than any order. "We still have breath in our lungs," he continued. "That means we're not finished." "Not yet." Slowly, heads lifted. The spark caught. A mechanic began checking a damaged rifle. An engineer patched holes in the remaining power generator, and medics tended to the wounded with renewed focus. They dug trenches, collected scraps of armor, and built barriers from the wreckage. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. That night, Ward sat by a small fire, the red glow flickering across his face. Around him, the others worked quietly, their fear replaced by a fragile determination. The storm had taken everything from them: ships, comrades, safety, but not their will. Vega 9 was silent now, but somewhere deep beneath that silence, humanity's heart still beat. And as long as it did, Captain Ward swore, they would not fall. Days slowly turned into weeks on Vega 9, but for the soldiers who had survived, time no longer felt real. The red sun rose and fell over the ruins, painting everything in shades of dust and blood. The silence that followed the attack never truly ended. It simply changed shape. The Varkan patrols roamed the wastelands, their machines scanning the broken landscape for any sign of life. They believed humanity was gone, wiped out with the rest of the colony. But deep beneath the shattered outpost, the last battalion still breathed. They had no flag, no command, and no reinforcements. But they had each other, and that was enough to keep them alive. They moved like shadows now, living in the dark tunnels under the ruined base. Every sound, every footstep mattered. The soldiers had learned to move quietly, to become part of the ruins themselves. Captain Ward led them with quiet precision. He knew they couldn't fight a war, not the way they used to, but they could survive, and sometimes survival itself was victory. At night, they watched the enemy patrols from the cracks in the walls, their glowing scanners sweeping across the dead city. The Varkan were tall, armored, and confident, certain they had broken the human spirit. But they were wrong. The humans had learned patience. They waited for opportunities, and when one came, they struck fast and vanished again. They began raiding enemy supply convoys, stealing food, medicine, and fuel. They even salvaged pieces of alien technology, broken weapons, power cells, communication chips, and learned how to repair and adapt them. The enemy's tools became their lifeline. Engineers worked by dim lanterns, fusing human metal with alien circuits, creating strange hybrids of both worlds. "If it works, we use it," Ward said simply. His calm voice was enough to keep the fear at bay. They managed to send coded distress signals every few days, hoping someone, somewhere, might hear them. But every transmission came back with nothing but static. The silence of space pressed on them like a weight, but still they refused to give up. The Varkan began to grow uneasy. Their patrols reported missing units, stolen cargo, and strange signs of movement at night. At first they dismissed it as malfunctioning sensors. Then one squad vanished completely. Another found their supplies gone and a single message carved into the metal floor in human letters. "Still here." Word began to spread through the enemy ranks, rumors of ghosts that hunted in the dark. Soldiers who would not die no matter how many times they were struck down. The Varkan began to whisper a name for them in their own language, one that roughly translated to the unbroken. For the humans, that fear became their greatest weapon. Every time they saw enemy lights in the distance, every time they heard the engines of a patrol craft, they felt that familiar fire inside them. The will to fight, not for victory, but for survival. They had been the hunted once. Now, in the ruins of Vega 9, the hunted had become the hunters. And for the first time in months, the humans began to believe they might outlast the darkness after all. The first winter on Vega 9 arrived like a curse. The planet had no snow, no gentle frost, only storms of acid rain and wind sharp enough to cut through steel. The red sand turned into rivers of poison, and the air grew heavy with the taste of metal. Every shelter the soldiers built seemed to crumble under the weight of the endless storms. They covered their camps with what scraps they could find, broken ship parts, burnt-out armor, pieces of alien hulls. But even then, the cold found its way in. The battalion, once proud and strong, now huddled together in silence as the world outside howled. Supplies ran dangerously low. Food packets were counted carefully. Water was rationed drop by drop, and the little energy they had left was saved for heat. The acid storms destroyed most of their remaining storage, forcing them to scavenge what they could from fallen enemy craft. Some nights they went without eating. Still, no one complained out loud. They had learned that silence was safer and hope was something they had to build for themselves. The soldiers moved slower now, thinner, weaker, but their eyes still held that same quiet defiance that Captain Ward had taught them. Ward refused to let despair win. Every evening, when the storms paused long enough to let them breathe, he would gather the survivors around the dim light of their last working heater. He would pull out a small digital tablet, cracked, fading, but still functioning, and read aloud old letters from Earth, messages from families, from children, from loved ones who still believed the soldiers were alive. The words were simple, filled with memories of laughter, home-cooked meals, and stories about a blue sky that none of them had seen in years. For a few moments, the camp wasn't cold or broken. It felt human again. One night, when the wind screamed outside their metal shelter, Ward stood up, his voice calm but strong. "If we die here," he said, looking around at the tired faces illuminated by the orange glow, "we die as proof that humanity does not vanish quietly." His words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. Every soldier listened, and every heart understood. That sentence became something sacred to them. They repeated it softly in the dark when the storms grew too loud or when fear crept into their minds. It was no longer just a promise. It was a reason to keep going. As the months passed, Vega 9 seemed to test them with everything it had. Cold that froze breath mid-air, storms that buried entire shelters, nights so dark that even the stars disappeared. But the battalion endured. They shared their warmth, their last rations, their hope. When one fire died, another soldier would light it again. And through it all, Captain Ward's words stayed alive among them, like a small flame that refused to go out. Vega 9 wanted to erase them, but the humans of the last battalion would not fade. They would burn until the end, not with anger, but with unshakable will, the fire that no storm could ever put out. 10 long months had passed since the last human voice faded into static. The soldiers had grown used to the silence of Vega 9, to the endless storms and the hum of alien machines they had stolen just to stay alive. But one cold morning, when the air outside was still and the horizon burned with the pale light of 2 distant suns, something changed. The engineer assigned to the old communications bunker was checking the scanners when he froze. Through the layers of static and distortion, he heard it, a faint tone, rhythmic and steady. It wasn't the sound of the enemy. It was something else, human. He called for Captain Ward, his voice shaking with disbelief. Ward hurried over, leaning close to the console, his eyes fixed on the flickering monitor. There it was again, a coded transmission, distant and broken, but undeniably real. "Human frequency," Ward whispered. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence that followed wasn't fear this time. It was hope, pure and unfamiliar. The sound filled the room like a heartbeat. Some soldiers began to smile for the first time in months. Others wept quietly, covering their faces. The message was too weak to decode, too far to trace, but it didn't matter. It meant someone out there was still listening. Humanity wasn't gone. They weren't alone. Ward gathered his people and made a decision. "We're answering," he said. They didn't have the proper tools, and most of their equipment had been destroyed or rusted beyond repair. But the humans had learned to build from nothing. They scavenged what they could: scrap metal, burnt power cores, and even alien circuits taken from broken enemy drones. The air around their camp filled with the sound of hammering sparks and determination. The engineers worked without sleep, guided by Ward's calm voice and their shared belief that this chance couldn't be wasted. Days turned into nights as they pieced together a transmitter. It was a patchwork of human and alien technology, unstable, fragile, but powerful enough to send a message into the void. When it was finally ready, they gathered around the machine. The power flickered. The air smelled of ozone and heat. Ward placed his hand on the control switch, his expression quiet but resolute. "Make it count," someone said softly. Ward nodded, took a breath, and spoke into the microphone. "This is Vega 9 Battalion," he said, his voice steady and clear despite the crackling noise. "Still alive. Still fighting. Vega 9. The message went out into the darkness, bouncing between stars, carrying their voices farther than any of them could see. Then, just like that, the signal died. The machine went quiet again. They waited for hours, hoping for a reply, but none came. Still, no one felt disappointed. Because for the first time in 10 months, hope had a sound. It was faint and distant, but it was real. That night, as they sat by the dim fire, someone whispered, "They'll come." Ward looked up at the stars and simply said, "They heard us. I know they did." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The day began like any other on Vega 9, cold, gray, and silent. But by midday, that silence shattered. The Varaken had found them. It started with a distant hum, low and steady, like thunder rolling across the desert. Then came the black dots on the horizon, drones, hundreds of them, descending from the clouds in perfect formation. The humans had always known this day would come. Their stolen transmissions, their raids, their defiance, all of it had left a trail. And now the enemy had followed it home. Captain Ward stood at the edge of the encampment, his boots sinking into the red dust. "Positions!" he called, his voice strong and steady. Around him, the Last Human Battalion moved into place with practiced calm. There was no panic, no shouting, just a quiet readiness, the kind that comes when people have already accepted what must be done. The engineers powered up the energy shields they had patched together from alien tech. The marksmen climbed the ruins to higher ground. The medics prepared the shelters below, their hands trembling but determined. Ward took a long look at the faces around him, tired, weathered, scarred, and felt something deeper than pride. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were history. When the first wave hit, the sky turned white with fire. The air filled with smoke and dust, and the sound of explosions rolled through the valley like thunder. The ground shook beneath their feet, but the humans held the line. Their weapons were old, their defenses weak, but they fought with precision and unity. Every move was measured, every shot counted. They had no illusions of victory, only purpose. A young soldier beside Ward reloaded his rifle, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Do you think Command ever got our message?" he asked. Ward's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Maybe," he said, "but that doesn't change what we do now." Hours passed, and the battle raged without end. The enemy's drones poured in waves, relentless and cold, but the humans refused to fall. They fought from the ruins, from the tunnels, from the shadows, striking, retreating, striking again. The air smelled of metal and heat, and every heartbeat felt borrowed. When one soldier fell, another took their place without hesitation. There was no room for fear now, only resolve. They weren't fighting for medals or glory. They were fighting so that somewhere, someday, someone would know humanity never gave up. By nightfall, the entire valley glowed with firelight. The battalion was down to half its number, but their spirit burned brighter than ever. Between attacks, they shared quick nods, silent smiles, small gestures that said more than words could. They knew this might be their last stand. But there was peace in that thought. Ward looked up at the red sky, streaked with smoke, and whispered, "Let them write the end." "We already wrote the story." The Varaken didn't understand what kept them standing when every logic said they should fall. But the answer was simple. Humans didn't fight because they expected to live. They fought because they couldn't bear to be forgotten. And as the siege of Vega 9 raged through the night, the Last Human Battalion proved one thing beyond doubt. They were unbroken. 10 years had crawled by on Vega 9. The once red sands were now scarred black by fire and ash, and the air always carried the faint smell of metal and storm. What had once been an encampment was now a fortress, a patchwork of human and alien wreckage welded together, half buried in the earth, half reaching toward the sky. The battalion had changed too. They were no longer the same young soldiers who had first arrived. Their faces were older, lined with hardship, their uniforms faded and torn, but their eyes still carried that same stubborn light. They had survived through storms, hunger, and endless nights of silence. They had buried friends and built walls with their bare hands. Hope had become a habit, even when reason said it was gone. Every sunrise felt the same, gray and distant. The soldiers went about their tasks quietly, repairing weapons, tending to the wounded, keeping watch from the towers they had built from fallen enemy drones. Captain Ward had stopped marking days years ago. Time had lost its meaning here. Yet, even as his hair turned silver and his voice grew rough from years of dust and shouting, he never once let despair settle. As long as one of us stands, he would tell them, humanity stands with us. And somehow that was enough to keep them going. Then one night, the world changed again. The sky, long dark and silent, suddenly filled with light. At first, they thought it was another attack. The ground trembled, and the soldiers ran to their posts, weapons in hand. But as the light grew brighter, they realized something was different. The color wasn't red, it was blue. The hum wasn't the cold, mechanical tone of the Varkan, it was familiar, almost human. A voice crackled through the old comms system they had rebuilt 100 times before. Vega 9, this is the Alliance fleet. We read your signal. We're coming home. For a long moment, no one spoke. It didn't feel real. Ward stepped outside, the cold wind brushing against his face. Above, the dark clouds broke apart, revealing shapes descending through the atmosphere, ships, human ships, glowing in the night like fallen stars. The blue light reflected off the ruined metal walls of the fortress, painting everything in a soft glow. Soldiers began to gather, some dropping their weapons, others just staring in awe. A few laughed, others cried. It was the sound of a miracle 10 years in the making. Ward stood at the edge of the base, his heart pounding. Drop pods streaked across the sky, landing one by one, shaking the ground. From the smoke stepped armored figures with the human insignia on their shoulders. Ward's throat tightened as he whispered almost to himself, "They came." For a decade, they had lived believing they were forgotten, but humanity hadn't abandoned them. It had just taken time to find them. The fortress that had once been a tomb now echoed with new life. And as Ward watched the sunrise chase away the last of the night, he realized something he had always hoped was true. No matter how far from home they had fallen, humanity had never stopped listening. When the ships finally returned to Earth, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The survivors of Vega 9 stepped onto solid ground for the first time in 10 years. Their boots touched the landing bay floor in silence, not because there were no words to say, but because none felt large enough. Only 23 of them remained from the battalion that had once numbered in the thousands. Their uniforms were faded, their scars deep, but their eyes burned with the same fierce life that had carried them through a decade of isolation. Reporters waited behind barriers, cameras flashing like stars, voices calling their names. Historians had already begun to write about them. The Last Human Battalion, the ghosts of Vega 9, the miracle survivors. To the public, they were heroes from legend. But to the soldiers themselves, they were simply human beings who had refused to give up. Captain Ward led them down the ramp, walking slowly, his shoulders straight despite the weight of years behind him. Officials rushed to greet him, offering medals and speeches. He listened politely, his face unreadable. When one young reporter asked how it felt to be called a hero, Ward paused, looking past the crowd toward the distant horizon. "We were never heroes," he said softly. "We were humans doing what humans do, endure." The simplicity of those words silenced everyone around him. They weren't about pride or glory, they were about truth. Humanity's strength had never come from power or perfection, but from its ability to stand tall, even when the world tried to break it. The soldiers were taken to medical centers, then to ceremonies that stretched across the colonies. Everywhere they went, people stood in awe. Children waved small flags. Veterans saluted with tears in their eyes. For generations that had grown up hearing of the Vega 9 disaster, these survivors were living proof that the human spirit could outlast anything. Schools began teaching their story. Artists painted murals of the fortress they had built from wreckage. Poets wrote about the fire that refused to die. Across every world where humans had settled, one phrase began to echo: the unbroken. Ward never got used to the attention. He visited the families of those who hadn't returned, leaving medals on quiet doorsteps, saying little but meaning everything. He spent his last years teaching young soldiers not how to fight, but how to believe. Courage, he told them, isn't about winning. It's about standing when everything else falls. And so the story of Vega 9 became more than a tale of survival. It became a symbol of what it meant to be human. Centuries later, long after the soldiers were gone, a plaque would stand in the Hall of History on Earth. It bore a single line: even when surrounded by darkness, humanity does not bow, it burns brighter. Those words, like the people who inspired them, would live forever.